Good morning. Today is September 30th, 2024, and today I wanted to talk about our General Addendum, Form 34. So the reason I wanted to talk about this one is because it's a pretty complicated form for having nothing on it. It is the General Addendum and it is blank. So I wanted to talk today about knowing when to use it and how to use it. When we do cross the line, like when do we actually cross the line from our agency duties to drafting as if we are a lawyer, and what we should be using with this form for, and then talking about the idea of this being a general addendum versus a notice. So first of all, Form 34 does come with a warning label. Warning label says, under Washington law, real estate brokers should not use or insert language that is not prepared by an attorney. You should not attempt to draft your own language in the contract on Form 34. This form should only be used to make modifications to the contract language of the purchase and sale agreement. If you need to give a notice, use the pre-printed notice form in the 90 series. The blank notice is Form 90, and those are available on Express Forms as well as Transaction Desk. So this is Form 34. It's blank, and a lot of times we will see it in transactions, but I wanted to bring up the fact that there are so many forms in our arsenal of library of forms that we may not need to ever use a Form 34 because it's quite likely that there's going to be a form for the purpose that we're reaching for this blank form. I also wanted to note that a Form 34 is completely different than a notice. So a Form 34 is a mutually signed amendment to the purchase and sale agreement. What it does is it connects whatever's written on here as a standalone agreement, but in retrospect and in conjunction with your mutual purchase and sale agreement. Now, a Form 90 is a notice. This is something that we're going to be not necessarily needing a mutual acceptance for, but more or less to just give additional information. And I'm going to go over exactly how to do the notice versus the Form 34. I also wanted to talk about the fact that neither of these should be used in a counteroffer situation. So if you are using a Form 34, make sure you are not using it to counteroffer terms of a purchase and sale agreement. Do not use it to change timelines. Do not use it with the expectation that you have not reached mutual acceptance for your contract. Any sort of back and forth conversations before mutual acceptance need to be done through the counteroffer form. And we'll go over this form in another class coming up on how to write this one up. So looking back, Form 34, like I said, is an amendment to the purchase and sale agreement. So in order to use this form, we're going to be using it for things such as creating verbiage on something that maybe the purchase and sale agreement doesn't particularly state in enough detail for us. We are going to use it as a standalone agreement. So whatever's written on this form is going to be an enforceable part of the contract. Now, how do we make these things enforceable parts of the contract? Well, we need to know the rules about what we can and cannot do with these forms. What we can do with a Form 34 are correct spellings. So this would be a situation where maybe I'll use my name, for example, maybe somebody left out one letter of my name, or perhaps I wanted to add my middle initial, but the buyer themselves is not changing. None of the contract terms are changing. This is just a name correction. Complete names, clarifying contract terms that
It's going to be annoying to you if I listen in here. It's just I can't hear.
clarifying contract terms that already exist. Sorry, I'm just going to mute.
What?
I'm just muting you. Sorry, clarifying contract terms that already exist. Or if we have scenarios that don't completely exist in the boilerplate language, sometimes we might be adding something to the 34 that helps define that. We want to use this form for something that we can use as a mutually defining term or something that's mutually agreed on. And I have examples of when to use these as we kind of move forward with this class. Now, when can we not use these? This is probably a bigger list than the ones for what we can use it for. We are not going to be creating counteroffers with a Form 34. We're not going to be using a 34 for notices that don't require both signatures. So if this is something that doesn't change the terms of the agreement and it's just a clarification, it's possible that a 34 is the wrong form for us to use. If we're just correcting an MLS number, for example, that's not a contract term that needs to be initialed around. If we remember back to our Form 21, there are certain parts of that first page of the purchase and sale agreement that don't necessarily require multiple signatures or initials just for correction. So anything that doesn't require a mutually signed around for correction can be done on a notice, not necessarily a 34. We are not going to be using a 34 in negotiations prior to mutual acceptance unless we are also noting them on the counteroffer form. But I would argue also that the counteroffer form will serve as a 34 in the negotiation process, so still to leave it out. We do not want to create new contract terms. We don't want to find ourselves drafting language that has an action that needs to be taken, a consequence for not taking that action. We don't want to put those words on paper when there may be another form in our library that we can use for that. And again, drafting that kind of language, creating those contingencies that don't previously exist are borderline practicing law, which is outside of our scope as we know. And then again, we don't want to create new contingencies. So contingencies that don't already exist that we want to create, we need to be really careful drafting language around those. So what if you do write something down? Well, if you do, I need everybody to remember that we can't forget the big five. So anytime you draft language, and this could be on an inspection response, part of your contract, on a 34, anytime we are bringing in a term that needs to be done with a consequence for it, we need to, number one, make sure that we are creating an enforceable contract with the terms that we're drafting. And then remember, once you put pen to paper or you start typing out the clauses, you're going to be held to the standard of an attorney. So you need to make sure that if you do in fact do these things, you're doing it in a way that is upholdable by the law. So we want to refer to the big five. My big five are what? What needs to be done? Who's going to be responsible for doing it? Who's going to be responsible for paying for it? When does that action need to be done? And what are the consequences for completing or not completing the task? So we can use these same 5 questions to answer pretty much any scenario that comes in. This doesn't necessarily have to be specific to repair work that needs to be done, but anytime there is an enforceable action, we need to be able to enforce it, and we can't do so unless we know all of these things. Who's going to do it? What needs to be done? Who's going to pay for it? And what are the consequences? So let's look a little closer at some 34s. I did bring up a few of them to use as examples on how we can draft on the 34 to help our clients, and when there would be situations where what we're trying to draft already exists in another space. So it would be better to pull in the forms that exist for that. So I kept all of the names out of this as much as possible. These are just examples. And this right here was not drafted by one of our agents in our office, but I'm using it as the example. So number 1, this person wrote, the seller is to pay 0 buyer broker compensations. Well, we know that line 17B would have said the same thing as this. So it's something that could have been negotiated by either a counteroffer form or placed in the 17B section of our first page of the purchase and sale. When you have somebody as number 2 that says the property is sold as is and the seller shall not be obligated to perform any work orders, that's kind of a redundant statement. The seller is never obligated to perform work orders, but if there is any sort of a financing contingency, there's going to be boilerplate language in there that does contradict what that says. So we need to make sure that if we are doing something like this, We don't have something else in our contract that's contradictory. Now, I don't know what's happening with this contract, so I can't speak as to the rest of the terms in it. I'm just bringing these things up so we can be aware that when we draft language, we don't create contradictory terms and we don't create contingencies on things that already exist elsewhere. In number 3, they wrote that the seller acknowledges that the buyer wants to develop this property and they're going to seek approval of the city, and the seller is going to agree that any related applications can be done, and the buyer is going to be completely responsible for associating, any costs associated with this. Well, if we think about the forms that we have available to us, this could have been explained pretty well with the feasibility form. That process is already laid out with the feasibility form itself. And there are optional spaces to write in, about the application process. This could have been something that we could have brought in another form for without having to completely draft this. But it is also possible that with access to the property and the application process, we may have needed to still have something in there allowing that application process to take place and move forward. And then when you have a clause as number 4 here, it says the seller shall not enter into any written or oral agreement for a sale agreement, a lease, or easement. Basically, what they want to say is, seller, you're selling me this property as it is right now, and you're not going to change any of that information. The seller may sign the agreement not to enter into any leases. But what I wanted to point out here is that if there truly is a lease already in place, there is a form for us to make sure that we are allowing that buyer to review all aspects of that lease. And I just wrote down it was 22L. Like I said, I don't know the situations behind some of these, but wanted to bring to light, if we're going to be drafting verbiage, there may be spaces that it already exists. Another example here is the seller shall grant access to the property periodically throughout the escrow period. Well, we do know that the buyer is not permitted to go to the property after the inspection or the feasibility. So if this is a permission the seller wanted to grant, this clause is probably needed if that buyer is to have permission to enter the property beyond the feasibility waiver. Other than that, the only other option would be to extend the feasibility to allow that continual access, which in this situation, I'm not sure would be beneficial. So this is something that would be an appropriate thing to write on a 34 if a buyer wants continual access afterwards. Again, if you are allowing a buyer to have continued access to a property after the waiver of all of their inspections, I would strongly advise them to reconsider or to consider speaking to an attorney about what the implications of that mean. Now, on number 8 here, we have the buyer is going to deposit the earnest money to escrow within 48 hours of the waiver of feasibility. Clarity on earnest money, if not clear on the first page of the purchase and sale agreement, may be needed. This is kind of one of those special situations where it's not something we could necessarily write in, but this might have been a very appropriate place to put that. I mean, somebody's not muted. I'm sorry. What's happening? Okay. And then number 10 right here, the buyer or broker has an interest in an LLC. These are absolutely required disclosures, and the Form 34 is the best place to put this kind of thing. This is something that not only is a disclosure, but also requires that buyer be aware of and acknowledge the fact of this relationship. So if you are an agent selling your own property, or if you have a family member you're assisting, you really do want to put this on a Form 34. It is the most appropriate place to disclose this. Now, a seller's name. We need to have a very, very long name that likely doesn't fit into the lines above. Now, if the name was already in there, but partially, it is definitely allowed to be expanded in a Form 34. However, if the seller's legal name or the buyer's legal name is not what is in the purchase and sale agreement, if it's changing, if it would be, if it said, Joe and Joe Smith is the seller, and then all of a sudden it's, oh no, I'm sorry, we're going to change this, or if it, say Joe Smith is the buyer, we're going to change Joe Smith to his LLC, or we're going to change it to this trust account or anything. If the name of the seller changes, you do need more than just a 34 to acknowledge this. You can acknowledge from the seller that the buyer is in fact changing the name, but also if you're changing the entity that's purchasing, you are technically changing the buyer, and the 34 is not going to be sufficient in its own. Now, this one here says that the seller is going to provide copies of the personal representative for the sale. It's not required that a party does this to the other party in the transaction, but rather to an escrow company. So this is something that could or could not have been left out of something like this. Additional parcels that are being purchased can also be noted on the first page of the Form 21 or whatever the purchase and sale agreement is. There are spaces for those to be done. Now, if those parcels are decided to be combined after mutual acceptance, the Form 34 is going to be a very appropriate place to add that. It's exactly where it should be. Anytime the terms are changed, say in feasibility, or if there's a difference in timeline that we can't quite get from the forms that exist already, it is also completely appropriate to put those on the Form 34. The example on this one is that the buyer may extend 15 days if they choose to extend the feasibility. That would be something that's put on the Form 34 because there is no place that currently exists. However, you can use the 22LA, and it does have a space for additional inspections where you could use that additional inspections for those 15 days. If you did not put that in your original purchase and sale, though, you would have to make note on a 34. So I'm not going to say that it's ideal, but it's definitely appropriate if you don't already have the form that allows you to do those extra days. Now, things like in the event the buyer terminates, all reports go back to the seller. We know that when we have a home inspection, we can use a 35C to require that buyer to give all of the reports. We don't really have anything like that for a feasibility per se. We could use the 35C demanding the reports be given. But if this is a situation where, hey, we don't need to see the reports unless you back out, then it would be okay to use the Form 34 to note something like that. These are not necessarily terms that change in the contract, but more clarification issues. And then if you are using anything to waive any contingencies, and you want to say like blanket statement, waive all contingencies, then something like line 17 is an excellent use of the Form 34. It just says all contingencies shall be deemed waived at the completion of the feasibility. This is exactly what you can use the 34 for. Keeping in mind too, though, that if feasibility is the only contingency, there is no reason to add that all are waived if it's the only one there. Another example, and just to think about, what am I writing on paper, and is there a form that better protects my client by the boilerplate language that's in that form? So here's an example. It says it's contingent on a satisfactory inspection of the septic. Now, this 4-line clause right here does give some very general information for us. However, it does lack some of those extra what happens if to make the contract enforceable. So if you're going to add something like this in a contingency form, I would highly suggest that instead of putting pen to paper on a blank form, that you just include a 22S or whatever septic form is appropriate for the county that you're in. Now, full names of sellers didn't fit. They were cut off the PSA. So to clarify with these names, the sellers are the estate of whoever, and the credit trust established under the last will and testament of this. So there are two different sellers, and those are actually the full names of each of the sellers. Title and escrow are also going to need the full names, and that includes a date as well. When you are dealing with an estate, you will also deal with a date. So it's going to be even more written out on the bottom of the 34. This one is, this person's name is the personal representative of the estate of so-and-so, and that person is the successor of the trustee of the credit trust established under the last will and testament of person dated this date. So that is the full paragraph name of the seller that title is going to take to kind of keep that chain of ownership. So if that name doesn't fit, a Form 34 is completely appropriate to go put in there. It is not appropriate, however, if your sellers are Joe and Jane Smith, and then you need to make sure that they have it under this, last will and testament. We can, as sellers, make sure that we are putting the correct names in when we check the title report in our listing agreements. So do your best to fit everything you can with our listing agreements and in our listing input sheets. Now, the 34 can also be used to potentially extend deadlines. If you have, say, a well-document review period, and you have a 22R, you want to extend that, you could also use this for that purpose as well. I'm sorry, somebody's unmuted. I'm not sure who it is or where to mute them. So what happens if we are using the form to draft language that already exists in our forms library? Well, I can tell you right now that our forms were drafted by a lawyer. They were drafted in a way that are enforceable and they have consequences. So if we are not up to that same standard, we should not be putting pen to paper. We should be searching for the form that exists with the purpose we're trying to create. So I wanted to bring up a couple question scenarios, just to make us think about kind of what we're looking at here. So number one, a buyer signs a 34. It is sent over to the seller in an attempt to change a contract term. How long does the seller have to respond to that request? So this would be an example of maybe they wanted an extension on a contingency timeline and sent over a 34 that says, contingency timeline for the well addendum shall be extended 2 weeks. Once you receive that as the listing agent, how long does that seller have to actually get the response back to the buyer? This is going to cause us to go ahead and think back to our general rules of contracts. So our general rule of contract says 2 days. So per the boilerplate language in our computation of time in the purchase and sale agreement, offers and counter offers are 2 days unless otherwise noted. So when we look at things going back and forth, we want to make sure that initials on 34 are within 2 days of each other. So we can make sure they are in fact enforceable. Second question, upon the completion of an inspection, the listing broker receives the buyer's inspection response on a 34 instead of a 35R. When that buyer broker and their designated broker were asked about it, they stated that since Form 35 says, and I quote, the parties may use the NWMLS Form 35R to give notices required by this addendum, the operative word being may, that the parties are not required to use the 35R. So with this being done, what are the implications of this choice that this broker did? Well, this is going to go back to the idea that our Form 34 is in and of itself a standalone agreement if signed around. If we are responding to a 35R and a 34 comes through mutually signed around, then it really doesn't matter what was on the 35R to begin with, because 34 is also a mutual part of our contract. It's an addendum to the contract. So the true answer right here is Form 34 is an addendum to the purchase and sale. However, it is not tied to that inspection contingency unless the parties specifically connect it through agreed language to the inspection contingency. This is why my number one advice for response on inspections with 35R is to use your 34 with a note on the top that says addendum to 35R. That is the way we connect our blank form to the contingency timelines of our inspection response. If you leave nothing on that 34 and you make no note on 35R that there is any connection with that form, then you are using it as a standalone amendment to the purchase and sale agreement, having not done anything to your inspection contingency timeline. So now thinking about that, if a seller does agree to make all the repairs requested on a buyer's 34, then the seller is likely going to believe that the buyer's inspection contingency is satisfied. However, there is nothing on the 34 that indicated the seller's agreement to the buyer's request for repairs constituted that satisfaction of the buyer's inspection contingency. Or the seller would have simply agreed to make the repairs, and the buyer would still have the right to terminate the purchase and sale because nothing's connecting the two of those together. So if you use a 34 in conjunction with your response to an inspection, and this can be any inspection, it could be feasibility, it could be well, it could be septic, it could be home inspection. You need to connect the two together with either a note in the top margin or something on the response form that connects those two, because the contingency timeline will only exist if those two are in response to that contingency. I hope this was able to clarify for you some of your questions you may have on the 34. And the takeaway from this is that the 34 is, in fact, just an addendum. It's an addendum to an already decided mutual contract. And you're just going to go ahead and be mutually deciding on the terms that you're changing on that. Make sure we're not drafting things that are unenforceable. And if you have any questions about what you are drafting, either get a second opinion or reach out to your managing broker. Thank you for listening.